In this video, we will be wrapping our Medallion Mastery program as well as including loads of tips on your binding. Let's get busy. Kaye England here, back with you on the Medallion Mastery program. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is borders. Now, for those who are not in the program, there's a load of information in this that really should help you with any quilt you're making, because our students that are in the program and have their new handout, primarily what they're doing is adding the last 3 borders. Let's just say that you're working from a pattern, as our mastery group is, and it tells you at this point, cut your borders 65.5. And you cut your borders 65.5. Hopefully any of you new or experienced would know that you can't do those measurements. You have to cut your border based on what your quilt really is. My rules have always been, when we do patterns, is we try to tell you what it should be. We would give you a little tip and say, at this point your quilt should be. But fully, I expect our people or anyone looking at a pattern I've done to know that you have to measure your quilt. It doesn't matter what it should be, it matters what it is. And what my suggestion to you on every border that you put on every quilt you make, regardless of whether that quilt has 3 or 4 or 5 borders added after those blocks are assembled, that you measure through the middle of the quilt. So what I typically would do is I would take my quilt and I would, if it's hanging on the wall or laying on the floor, it doesn't really matter, and you measure from the top to the bottom through the middle, and you measure from the left side to the right side through the middle. That tells me what my border's got to be. And it is not unusual to see the left side of a quilt be 1 inch to 2 inches longer than the right side of the quilt. Because depending on the pieced elements that live in that quilt, it is easy for that to happen. But where you have the opportunity to resolve the problem is when you measure through the middle. So I measure top to bottom first, and that tells me how big the left and right side borders got to be. And then I will add that border by marking the center, measuring the center of the quilt, put a pin, measure the center of the border, pin those together, and then I will ease in the difference of if my quilt is too large, or even if it's too small, the middle of that quilt should give you the solution. The quilt that is on the table is one that I worked on in the session, and I decided not to add all the borders, but what I've done is left these last 3 that I added since our last session. And I haven't pressed this or anything because I want you to be able to see this. This was a fabric that I had used before. This is my stripe, my repeating stripe that I added, and you can see there's a little movement. It's a little roughly, and I'm going to pull this back so that you can see that I have not pressed this. And the reason I haven't pressed it is I measured my quilt. So it didn't make any difference. People will say, well, if you press it, then it's all flat and you know what it's supposed to be. It doesn't matter what it's supposed to be. If you measure the center of that quilt and you make that border that size, it will fit that outside, or you got a major problem if it does. I mean, you can force the outside to come in. But what you can't do is put a border on it that's too long and then have it quilted and then try to square it, because you can't fix it then. So by doing this, when this would be ready to be quilted, then I would do a final press. And I want to also bring one thing to the attention as you look at the quilt on the table. I ended up really perplexed about what I was going to put on the last border, and I found an old home deck fabric that I had that I just had a smaller piece of it, and it's a little bit different weight. So consequently, it was going to handle a little different. I still measured through the middle of my quilt after this, and that's what I cut the left and right side. Then I measured from side to side, and that's what I cut my top and bottom. So when you're adding your borders, whether they have cornerstones or what you're doing, be sure you take the time to do that. The quilt that you see behind me on the wall is like our main project quilt, but I still didn't add the last border because, frankly, folks, I have way too many quilts anyhow, and this was as large as I wanted it to be. But as you look at this quilt, you'll see that I did put my main floral as the border that has the little log cabin blocks in the corner. Those could easily be cornerstones or triangles, but I remade the same little log cabins that lived in the center block, and it gave it a little bit more impact. And I am still about 10 inches maybe smaller than the blue quilt, which is our main quilt. So as you look at all three of these quilts, they all have the same center. They all have the first border, the piece border, and then I started altering what I did with each one of them. So the mother quilt, the blue quilt, is the one that I made first, and that's what our pattern is following. Other than that, I played around with the other two and stopped and started when I wanted to. So for any of you who are watching this video and you went, well, gosh, I didn't even know there was that program was available. It doesn't matter when you do this, because it's pretty much the same thing as if you bought a pattern at the store and went home to make it. You would have the pattern in front of you. You would have the support videos to fall back on. We perhaps might not forever have the Facebook page, but you would have all the support that you would need, plus all of our little tips and techniques videos. Hopefully that would help you in planning your borders. And if they're pieced, I still make sure I measure that pieced border and I make it accommodate whatever the center of my quilt is. So there's the tip for borders for you today. Now, when my quilt comes back from the quilter, the very first thing I do is lay it on the table and try to decide how much am I going to trim off of this quilted border. And in this case, as you can see from looking at my ruler, 3 inches seems to be the magic number I'll be working with. And that's going to be an arbitrary number unless you have piecing at the outside edge. That's going to be a problem. So the only thing I do is decide that I'm dealing with 3 inches. I'm going to, these quilts are big, so you're going to have to use your body to hold your quilt. I trim a small segment at a time, get that cut so that you get it out of your way, slide your ruler, and be very patient as you work through this while you get all of this excess off. And then when you come into a section, and you're going to see this with machine quilting where there's a little bump and it looks like there's a problem, but if you manhandle that and let your ruler do the work for you and kind of realign this, because you've got to trim on a square. In other words, you've got to keep the 90-degree angles on the corner, and so don't just whack across there. Take your time, let your ruler do your work, keeping that clean 90-degree corner that you see, and then continue working across in that same fashion. And at this point, I'm making sure that if I didn't have a clean 90, I'm going to have to take my cutter and I'm going to have to that corner's got to be a 90 degree in order to apply that binding and have a clean cut. Then I'll continue around the corner in the same fashion we've been doing, double checking that all my corners are 90-degree corners. That's a lot of quilt to handle. Now, when I get into this section, I want to, again, take my time to make sure if there's any discrepancy, like that little bump out right there. If you just run across that, you're going to have a nasty corner. But see how I'm kind of forcing it to come back into play. And the machine quilting, regardless of the skill level of the quilter, it's always going to be a tad distorted or can be on the corners. So take your time and be very patient on those corners. And we're done. And now let's join those binding strips. Now I've pre-cut all of my strips. You got to do your math on how many strips you need. I'm just joining a 45-degree corner. I kind of trim all of those off. Now, unlike a lot of people who make their bindings, I like mine 2 inches because I just happen to like the way it looks. So regardless of the size you cut, but I do not press. I finger press. As you can see, what I'm doing is just gently folding that prior to adding it to my quilt, because I think it's easier to not have pleats in that binding as you sew it, and then when I fold it over, I've got a really clean, tight binding. So this is preference. I always leave a little tail because when I come back to join it after I've added this binding, I want at least say 10, 12 inches added. And you want to kind of think about where you're going to start, because if you don't want seams to end up in the corner, you may have to do a little math, but I'll show you how I deal with that if we run across it anyhow. So I just pick a starting point, go into my machine, and I still sew at my 1/4 of an inch. I've got my folded edge right to the edge of my binding, and I'm just joining in a plain stitch. And as we approach the corner, you've got to stop a 1/4 of an inch from the corner. So if you don't have a mark on your machine or anything, you're going to have to put a pin or something in that corner so that when you get a 1/4 of an inch from the corner, you know where to stop. On my machine, I have marks on my feet, but if you don't, just to be a safeguard, stick a straight pin straight in that, because that's your starting or your stopping point. And then I can sew right up to a 1/4 of an inch, because see, my foot has a 1/4 in front of the needle, a 1/4 on the needle, and a 1/4 behind the needle. So I can use my foot without using that pin. The real tricky thing on these is the corners. Now there's probably 20 ways to sew this. This is how I do it. I stop a 1/4 of an inch from the corner, fold a 45-degree, fold down, make sure that that lines up and go straight back into your machine and continue. And we'll do at least one more corner so you'll be able to see that turn. And then now you're just sewing. See, making sure that when I open that up, see how that gives me a perfect miter right there. And now we're just going to join. When you come to these, I don't feel the need to press that. I finger press as I come to that joiner where I join my 2 strips together. If you feel like you want to press that in advance, that would be up to you. I don't, because I don't feel like I need to. Now here we come to another corner. You'll see I've used the pin again, just as an example. I do use my stiletto or my hand to kind of press as I go, because I think that helps keep my edges even with the edge of my trimmed quilt. We just work through this, and this is a big quilt, so this is a little bit of handling to maneuver all of this in your machine. Now, one of the things that always happens is that you end up with a joined seam in the corner, and it's a disaster, folks. You've got to fix it. So we're going to show you how to fix it. When I run across that, I've got to cut that joiner out. And you can take it out of the machine if you feel like you need to, but just get that join out so that you can back up a little bit and rejoin, so that when you finish that corner, you do not have that 45-degree seam landing on that corner, because you will never be able to turn it and have a clean corner. So we do the same thing we did when we first began and joined all of our strips. We put the 45, take that out of the machine, trim that off, and act like we never had that problem. And I have it happen about 1 quilt out of 5 or 6. I think it's easier to fix it than it is do all that pre-measuring and driving yourself crazy, but that's a personal choice. Back in the machine, and now we're still doing our same thing, going back to our corners, paying close attention, stopping the 1/4 of an inch before, finger pressing that joiner seam. If you have any loose threads, get those out of your way while you're joining. Again, pay attention to that stopping 1/4 of an inch from the corner. Now, here's where we end up with a little bit of how do you handle this. So what I'm going to do, that joiner piece, or where I started, I'm going to take where I'm ending, mate those up and put a pin in that spot. Then I'm going to use my rule. I just need 2 inches, or whatever the width of your border is, and in my case it's 2 inches. Past the pin, I need to add 2 inches. Now, we went to a cheater piece to show you this a little clearer. I used a fat marker, which I probably wouldn't have. So I've extended past the meet point the width of the border. Go back and join those on a 45, just like we joined our very first 2 pieces in the machine. There you go. And here we're going to show it to you again on the real quilt, because I felt like it was a little bit easier to see it on something without the bulk of the quilt. Again, I'm going to use a fine tip Sharpie or a pencil to mark this. And sometimes I don't even mark it. I just pick up a pair of scissors and make that cut. But I'm the width of my border. So if my border had been 2.5, I would have marked 2.5 past the pin. And I use a little end piece of my actual border or binding strip because it's already the exact width. So you don't even have to measure. You can just cut a corner off of that strip and lay it down. And then we're right back to that 45-degree. And boy, this is where it's really sweet when you join this one. And again, you've got to handle this quilt. The other thing that I like to do, there's a little fold there that if you can see that, I take the tip of my scissors and clip that off, because I have found when I'm hand stitching, this gives me a cleaner corner. And I also take a little, see if you just can get the point of your scissors in there and just get that out, and it doesn't, I've never had it impact the other side. Somebody's probably having a fit right now that it's going to tear out the other side. And then I take a little of that batting out because that gives me a cleaner miter. So see, when I fold that back, by cleaning that up a little bit, it seems to make my corners a little bit cleaner, and it gives me that nice 45 miter on the front side as well as the back side. So I like to iron. Once I've attached my binding, I go to the iron, and I want a lot of steam, and I go from the body of the quilt all the way out to the binding, and I flatten that binding. This way I've got a creased seam on the outside of that binding, and any fullness that might have gotten in there is taken care of with the steam, so that when I go back now to do my handwork, look how nice it is to just slide right in there. And I come in and I just take a little whip stitch. I don't use clips. I don't use pins. I keep the bulk of the quilt away from me and only the binding facing my body. I'm a right-hander. And then I'm stitching to my left. And I typically, I'll use a variegated thread sometimes. I just want a thread that kind of hides itself a little bit. Take as tight a stitch as you're willing to take. I don't worry too much. Sometimes I use a 40 weight thread because it's a little bit heavier and I feel like it maybe is a little stronger. I don't clip these. I just use my hands and my needle to do the work for me, and I work a stitch or two at a time till I'm done. And this is probably the hardest part for some people, but I like putting my bindings down by hand. All good things have to come to an end, folks. So hopefully you enjoyed the binding and you learned a few tips and techniques there. And the only thing that I can say is, for however rewarding this program has been for our group members as well as all of our viewers, we appreciate all your time. We appreciate your comments. We appreciate you following us, and we look forward to seeing you on a future video. But we do thank you for all your support. Stay safe, have a great time piecing, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.